Once, the west coast of Canada teemed with life. Beneath the surface of the water stretched dense underwater kelp forests, home to thousands of marine creatures. These forests fed, sheltered, and protected fish, crabs, mollusks, even birds. They supported fisheries, tourism, and coastal communities. But everything changed. Where green thickets once grew, now stretched endless fields of purple sea urchins, devouring the last remnants of life. The kelp was gone. The fish followed, and with them, the hopes of fishermen. People returned with empty nets, and scientists desperately sought answers to what was destroying the ocean from within. The answer was terrifying. The main predator of sea urchins, the sea otter, had nearly vanished. During the fur trade frenzy of the 1700s and 1800s, otters were killed by the thousands. Their fur was considered the warmest and most valuable. By the mid-20th century, they were almost extinct. Without otters, the urchin population exploded. They devoured the kelp down to its roots, and soon the ocean floor became barren. A chain reaction began. With no kelp, there were fewer fish. Juvenile salmon, which used to hide in the kelp, disappeared. Fisheries declined. Coastal lands began to erode. Kelp had once held the soil together. Scientists feared the ecosystem might be lost forever. Then came a wild, risky, almost insane proposal. What if we bring the otters back, take hundreds from wild populations, and release them into the dying sea? This wasn't just about saving an endangered species. It was a gamble that a single predator could revive an entire ecosystem. Canadian scientists called it predator-driven restoration. The otters would reduce the urchin population, allowing the kelp to return, and with it, everything else. In the late 1960s, Canada launched the boldest environmental operation in its history. The plan seemed doomed. Relocating otters required transporting them by ships and military aircraft in special containers that maintained comfortable conditions. The animals didn't handle stress well. Some died in transit, and those that survived often swam far away from the release sites. Scientists lost track of them. Data was inconsistent. Results were unpredictable. And yet, despite the failures, the project continued. In the quiet coves of British Columbia, otters began to settle. People doubted, criticized, and called the idea foolish. But something remarkable was happening underwater. The first signs of change appeared. Where otters stayed, the sea urchins began to disappear. The carpet of urchins thinned. In these places, thin ribbons of kelp began to grow again, slowly reaching toward the light. It wasn't yet restoration, but it was movement in the right direction. Fish fry began to find shelter again. Starfish, crabs, and small invertebrates returned. The once silent ocean stirred with life. And then, Canada realized its desperate experiment was starting to work. As the kelp returned, something truly amazing happened. The underwater forests became more than just shelters for marine life. They began to reshape the very nature of the coastline. Areas once ravaged by storms were now protected. The kelp softened waves, prevented soil erosion, and stabilized the shoreline. And that was just the beginning. Beneath the green canopy, fish populations exploded. Flounder, rockfish, herring, even salmon. Sea lions and seals returned to hunt the fish. And behind them, like links in a chain, came back the sea birds. Even sea anemones and rare nudibranch that had vanished from the area reappeared on the rocks. People who had believed the ocean to be dead couldn't believe their eyes. The ecosystem, once stripped to the bone, was coming back to life before them. But with hope came a new conflict. Local fishermen and shellfish harvesters began to notice that otters weren't just eating sea urchins. They hungrily devoured crabs, mussels, scallops, and clams, the very foundation of coastal livelihoods. A single adult otter could eat up to a quarter of its body weight each day, and their numbers were growing. In some villages, catches were cut in half. Fishermen sounded the alarm. People who once supported restoration began to question whether nature's return was coming at too high a cost. Indigenous coastal communities responded especially strongly. For many, shellfish and crabs weren't just food, they were part of tradition. Otters had once been hunted and respected, but now they had returned by government order without the consent of the communities. Town hall meetings erupted. They're saving the animals but forgetting us, elders shouted. In some places, poaching incidents were reported. Unknown individuals set traps to stop the otters from spreading. Meanwhile, the otters behaved unpredictably. They didn't stay in release zones. They rapidly explored new areas. Some swam dozens of kilometers, showing up in unexpected places, disrupting scientific plans. One group of 3 otters reached a reef where no one expected them, and, in a single week, wiped out a mussel bed that had supported a local family business. Still, despite protests and difficulties, scientists continued to monitor the project. They noticed something critics missed. In areas where otters stayed the longest, miracles were happening. Sea urchins retreated. Kelp grew back like in a time-lapse video. Within a few years, these zones became islands of life amid the barren seabed. In one bay, biologists recorded the return of seahorses, a species not seen there in nearly 30 years. The project seemed chaotic, unpredictable, and even economically threatening. But it was working. Nature was recovering without human interference. Thanks to a single predator, the same one nearly exterminated by humans. And now, the sea seemed to be saying, "Give me the otter and I will live again." By the early 1980s, it became clear, despite criticism, sea otters weren't just surviving, they were reshaping the coast. In several bays once dominated by sea urchins, thick kelp forests now swayed, teeming with life below. Fishermen who had once complained were now catching more fish in neighboring areas. Those who didn't rely solely on shellfish noticed the water was richer and cleaner. Still, not everything went smoothly. Rumors spread among fishermen that otters had wiped out a crab population in one bay. People accused the government of sacrificing the economy for the sake of wildlife. One fishery owner filed a lawsuit demanding compensation for alleged damages. The media picked up the story, and it began to snowball. Opposition politicians accused the authorities of ecological extremism, and some activists even called for the project to be shut down. But then, something no one expected happened. Independent researchers published data that flipped the narrative. In zones with stable otter populations, harvestable fish stocks had almost doubled. The water contained less carbon dioxide and was less acidic. Kelp, by actively absorbing CO2, was literally cleaning the sea. The news shocked the public. Those who had condemned the otters began to change their views. One particularly striking twist occurred in a small village by the strait. A local tour company, nearly bankrupt due to a decline in tourism, decided to take a gamble and offer otter tours. No one believed people would pay to float on gray water to see a few animals. But within a month, the company couldn't keep up with bookings. People came from all over the country to see otters swimming in the kelp forests, holding paws. Tourism began to replace shellfish gathering as the main source of income, and local cafes, souvenir shops, and boat rental stations experienced an unexpected boom. Meanwhile, scientists began noticing something unusual. In areas where the otters had already settled in, even species no one expected to return began to reappear. A diver accidentally encountered a swarm of extremely rare moon jellyfish that had vanished after industrial pollution in the 1960s. Their reappearance became a symbol. Nature wasn't just recovering, it was being reborn. But behind this miracle lurked a new threat. With the growing interest in ecotourism and sea otters, the region began attracting not only tourists, but also companies looking to profit from a new otter craze. Proposals emerged to build hotels, construct piers, and expand fishing operations beyond protected areas. There was a real risk that the very people inspired by nature's recovery might once again end up harming it. Canada stood on the brink of a new choice. Would the country be able to preserve what had already been saved, or would success become the beginning of a new cycle of destruction? By the early 2000s, otters had spread along the entire coast of British Columbia. Their population surpassed 5,000 individuals and continued to expand into new marine areas. The ecosystem that once seemed doomed was now nearly unrecognizable. Kelp blanketed the seafloor. Fish returned in abundance, and sea stars, anemones, and seahorses adorned every reef. But then scientists made troubling observations. In some bays where otters had been present for a long time, a new anomaly began to unfold. Kelp wasn't growing as rapidly as expected. Worse, unfamiliar brown algae began to appear, displacing native species. The previously decreasing acidity levels began to rise again. Researchers raised the alarm. Something was going wrong. The first suspicions pointed to climate change. Ocean temperatures had risen by nearly 2 degrees Celsius in recent years, a critical shift for sensitive kelp species. The water was becoming more oxygen depleted, and storms had grown more frequent. The otters were doing their job, controlling sea urchins and maintaining balance. But new threats emerged beyond even their ability to manage. A question arose. Would one predator be enough to save the sea from global warming? This sparked a new wave of debate. Some scientists proposed another intervention, artificially introducing resilient algae species, managing otter populations, and creating a new generation of marine reserves. But not everyone agreed. Indigenous representatives insisted that nature must not be controlled again. Instead, they argued we must work with it. They proposed a different approach, a collaborative management system where scientists and local communities would jointly monitor the sea and make decisions together. It marked a new turning point, not just in conservation, but in merging science and tradition. Meanwhile, the economic benefits of otters continued to grow. A study by the University of British Columbia showed that the annual value of the ecosystem's recovery exceeded $50 million. Fisheries became more stable. Tourism created more jobs, and otter tours were booked a month in advance. Even carbon emissions began to decrease. Kelp absorbed and stored carbon dioxide, and parts of it settled on the ocean floor, effectively removing carbon from the cycle. But again, there was an unexpected twist. A large corporation offered to sponsor a massive expansion of the project. Tourist facilities, a sea otter research center, and sightseeing platforms. At first glance, it seemed like a great idea, but behind closed doors, plans were discussed for drilling near new reserves and expanding shipping routes. All of this posed a threat to otters, who are highly sensitive to pollution. A single oil spill could wipe out the regional population in a matter of days. Activists and environmentalists took to the streets again, recalling the Exxon Valdez disaster in 1979, when thousands of otters died in crude oil. People demanded strict laws, bans on drilling, and limits on shipping near otter territories. For the first time, the government began talking not only about restoration, but about long-term protection. The question had changed. How do we not just bring nature back, but keep it safe from ourselves? Otters revived the ocean, but now people had to decide whether they would be nature's allies or its next threat. By 2025, sea otters have become not just a symbol of restoration, but living proof that one decision can change everything. British Columbia shone with new marine landscapes, like scenes resurrected from a long-forgotten era. Kelp forests swayed in the tides. Fishermen once again felt the scent of success, and tourists lined up for a single glimpse of otters playing in the shadows of seaweed. It seemed like a happy ending, but things turned out more complicated. One spring day, a disaster shook the country. On the southwestern coast, near a popular marine reserve, a serious chemical spill occurred from a cargo ship. A cloud of toxic waste spread through the water, covering one of the new otter settlement areas. Local residents were first to report seeing dead fish and the strange color of the water. Scientists and volunteers rushed to the site, but it was too late. More than a dozen otters died within a day, and several dozen more went missing. The public was outraged. People who had once been skeptical of the project now demanded answers. Why weren't proper precautions taken? Why were toxic ships operating near a reserve? And most importantly, who allowed this to happen? The government imposed an emergency ban on shipping in the affected zone. The Minister of Environment made a public statement, promising stricter laws. But behind all this was a much more troubling conclusion. Even a strong ecosystem is vulnerable when profit is placed above nature. At that moment, indigenous communities proposed a new historic initiative to create a co-governing council, not just advisory, but with real authority. It would include biologists, ecologists, community leaders, and representatives of coastal villages. Together, they would make decisions on protection zones, tourism access, ship monitoring, and even seasonal fishing limits. The government accepted the proposal. For the first time in Canadian history, Ocean governance was placed not only in the hands of officials, but also of those who had lived beside this water for generations. Meanwhile, a new idea began to gain momentum in scientific circles. If the sea otter could bring an entire coastline back to life, perhaps its role wasn't finished yet. Scientists suggested using Canada's success story as a model for other regions where ecosystems are on the brink, from Chile to Japan, from California to the North Atlantic. Anywhere kelp forests have been destroyed, the otter could become a key to recovery. The idea was called the otter effect, a chain reaction of restoration, starting with a single predator. What began in desperation and skepticism was now being considered as a global strategy. But even here came a word of warning. Otters are not magic. They can't succeed without protection, wise management, and respect for nature. If humans continue to see the ocean as a resource rather than a living system, no animal will be able to save it. The story of sea otters in Canada didn't end with a happy ever after, but with a transition to a new phase. It was not a conclusion, but a beginning, a lesson that must not be forgotten. The otters returned. The sea came back to life. But the real choice, whether to preserve it or lose it all again, remains in human hands. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more incredible and inspiring stories about nature, survival, and unexpected twists of fate. Your subscription is our sign that you're with us.